think about what President Bush said there. What he talked about in that short segment is the argument that's been enduring for years about conflict, that at certain moments, force has to be used to bring about peace. And the debate is that as old as time as to whether or not that actually has to happen that way, whether or not we have to use force, or whether or not diplomacy is more powerful. What is the path to a more peaceful existence for everybody on the planet? And these are some of the questions that we're tackling right now as a nation, so many nations, and our role in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's transpired over the last year. The big event of this week, of course, is that you have President Xi, the leader of China, visiting with President Putin. This is a very high-profile visit. This just started on Monday. It's going to cross over several days. We don't have a ton of images or videos right now of what's happened. Apparently, the first sort of line item on the agenda, besides the welcome of President Xi at the airport in Russia, which the Russian president did not attend, that's not part of their tradition, was a formal dinner between the two. And so we don't have a lot of insight into that. There is a big question as to what is China's role? What will be the outcome of this meeting, if anything? As we've talked about over the last several weeks, one of the reasons we're paying attention to this meeting is it's not only that you have these two really high profile world leaders coming together that have been antithetical to the West in their philosophy on leadership, but also in how they see the world. Not only is it because of the pairing, but could there be some sort of change in the path forward in Ukraine? We've talked about the concern from U.S. officials as high as the President of the United States that China will provide lethal weapons to Russia to use in Ukraine, and that would tilt the battle in Russia's favor. That's a big if. We have no idea if that could happen from this meeting, but it's something we're going to be watching for. We're also going to be watching this, though. Over the last week, China was able to broker a deal between two unlikely sources, Saudi Arabia and Iran. They hadn't had diplomatic relations for years for a myriad of different reasons, but China was part of bringing them together and reestablishing diplomatic relations. And they've been described, China has, as an attempt to become a peace broker in the world, to bring people together, to show that they are world leaders. It's not just the United States. It's not just Western powers that can do this. China can do it too. China also happens to be huge customers of Middle East oil. So using their not only their standing in the world, their economic standing, to try to promote some sort of change. Now, does this solve all of the conflicts that are happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, what's going on in the Middle East? Certainly not, but it was notable. So the question here is, could China also try to serve in that capacity as well? These are two very different storylines. Either we could see an escalation of the war potentially, or could we see a deceleration where China is able to negotiate in some way? Sounds implausible, but we don't know. We don't know. This is all on the table. In the meantime, we got a lot of reminders about why you have to be very skeptical of headlines. Let's just go over a couple of them. Over the last week, we've heard that Ukraine is going to receive fighter jets from Poland and Slovakia. Right away, I see that headline. I think, wow, that's a major escalation, because that means that Ukraine's going to be able to battle Russia from the sky. I mean, that is a really big deal. The United States has not done this, but Poland, big ally, big member of NATO, is doing it. Okay, you take a closer look at it. What do you see? Poland is providing 4 Soviet-era fighter jets to Ukraine. That's not an F-16. That's not the highest caliber of fighter jets that, for example, the United States has. It still means something, but it's just a handful of fighter jets. So again, a reminder about that. You saw this big headline about an arrest warrant being issued for President Putin from the International Criminal Courts, ICC. That seems like a really big deal. Is he going to get arrested and dragged away in the middle of the night to some court somewhere and tried for his alleged war crimes? Well, then we take a closer look and we realize that the members of the ICC do not include Russia, do not even include the United States or Ukraine or China, which means that we're not participating. We're not legitimizing this court in any way. Why wouldn't the United States do that? Well, there's a couple reasons, but one of them being that as a U.S. citizen, one of the things that America feels like I'm owed is due process. We have a particular justice system in the United States, and participating in this international court system could be taking away the rights of an American to a fair trial as we see it. So we've decided over the years in multiple administrations that we're not going to participate in this. So again, sounds like a big headline. It is a big headline. An arrest warrant issued for President Putin, but does it have the teeth to actually lead to an arrest and a prosecution of the Russian president? Not likely. Seems more symbolic at the time. So we'll continue to watch this. A year into the war in Ukraine, why all of this matters is a question about what's next. Does the war continue as it is? We heard from Ina Sovsin, our interview from last week, a member of the Ukrainian parliament and a mother, that the only thing that would be victory for Ukraine would be to get Russia completely out of Ukrainian territory. We saw President Putin visit a key strategic city in the south of Ukraine that's controlled by the Russians over the weekend. And it was a sign, it was described as a sign of defiance because he went there and he felt secure enough to go there. And so the question is that plausible? Can you figure out a way to end the war without that hard line about territory? That's a big question. And so we'll watch this week. There'll be a lot of developments. It's hard to know on Monday what we'll see, but we know now why the visit from the Chinese president matters. And we're going to pay attention to the way forward on that. In the meantime, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening here at home regarding our banking system, but really the financial system has to do with the entire world. And we got another reminder of that because here another weekend goes by where we're getting headlines about a potential bank collapse. This time it's not in the United States, it's in Switzerland. And that really matters. That's been glossed over a little bit. You know, Switzerland, a beautiful country, a peaceful nation, a neutral nation, a nation that does not get involved in war, has a safe and secure banking system, a stable economy. The banking system is used by people all over the world, governments all over the world, because of the stability and peace in Switzerland and the fact that you can have some anonymity when you're banking in the Swiss banking system. And you have the two largest banks at the center of this story, UBS and Credit Suisse. UBS ends up buying Credit Suisse because there's concern about the stability of Credit Suisse. And this is where it's interesting. There's many, I overuse that term interesting, by the way. We should keep tallies because I realize that I call a lot of things interesting because the reality is I do think that, but I'll have to think of a better word. The situation with Credit Suisse is unique in that oftentimes when there is a banking crisis, we can say, oh, well, this is the reason why there's a banking crisis because of X, Y, and Z. With Credit Suisse, it seems to be an accumulation of concern about the bank over the last several weeks. A bank can have issues for two very basic reasons. Either people, normal, quote unquote, people, you and me, pull our money out of a bank real fast and decide we're just going to move it. That causes a lot of problems for a bank that depends on those funds. The second way is investors do the same thing. Hey, I don't know what's going on with this bank. I'm going to pull my investment from the bank. I'm going to pull my stocks from the bank. That causes also issues, especially of confidence and stability for the bank. It looks like it's a combination of a few of those things. There's been concerns about Credit Suisse over the last several weeks, sort of as this turmoil that's taking place. They came to sort of an apex over the weekend. And the Wall Street Journal described what happened with the buying of UBS buying Credit Suisse as a forced marriage of sorts, which is not a very attractive way to describe this. Any sort of a marriage, a forced or arranged marriage for the stability of the banking system in Switzerland, but also because all of these banks also do business with each other. These banks are considered the top echelon, let's say the top 30 banks in the world, that if something happened to one of them, it could cause a domino effect in other ways because of all the money that's changing hands so quickly. And so one, I think it's important to know that this happened in Switzerland. It's not, it would be different if it happened in a different European country, but particularly Switzerland matters. This raises more concerns about, well, what's lurking in the background for some of these banks that really don't telegraph any emergency signals. I mean, there's a couple things that can make investors concerned or consumers concerned, but it's not like this huge explosion. So what is hiding in the background? Like, how stable is the financial system if we're having multiple weekends over the last month where regulators in the United States or in Switzerland believe they have to step in because they don't want to cause contagion if these banks collapse? So these are some questions that are still sort of lingering here on Monday. Yeah, Credit Suisse didn't collapse because UBS bought it, was forced to buy it. But what else is underneath? And so here are two things that I think are really important to pay attention to as part of the conversation moving forward and how it could just affect the way that we bank. We've talked about that there is a certain amount of insurance, FDIC insurance. So if I have a certain amount of money in the bank, let's say $250,000 in a bank, the government is insuring that to that amount. And basically that's supposed to provide me some confidence that if anything happened to the bank, there was a wayward leadership, something, a big financial crisis happens again, I have some confidence in the banking system. The US government is backstopping that here at home as a way to say the American banking system is safe. We're going to add that insurance so people know that they can bank here and that we're one of the leading financial systems in the entire world. That's what that's about. That $250,000 level per individual has been set for years. Now some more lawmakers are coming out and saying, you know what, that shouldn't be 250,000. That should be 1 million, 2 million, $5 million, because small businesses need to have confidence. Maybe they have more than $250,000 in the bank. So that's a topic of conversation, just something to be aware of. The second thing is what we're seeing now is so different than the financial crisis of 2008 for a myriad of different reasons, including the fact that in 2008, you had all these big banks made really bad bets. If you remember about the housing industry, mortgage-backed securities, gets a little complicated, but there was a lot of bets on that. Now it's a different situation. And in fact, I have something to show you. This is the New York Times. And this is not true of every single bank, but it's part of the scenario that's taking place right now because there's high inflation and because we're raising interest rates. This is something that's happening to the banks at this time. So here's just a little graph. This is one of the best graphics I've seen on this. And it shows what happens to a hypothetical bank with $2 billion. And basically it shows that the bank, what it does is it gives half that money, $1 billion, to loans. It's making money off the interest rates of loans, and it's putting the rest of the money in government bonds, which is typically a safe bet. It's not like a risky, crazy thing to do. These government bonds are usually considered, quote unquote, safe bets. As you can see from this graph, though, when interest rates rise, the new bonds that are issued, they pay out more than the old bonds. Old bonds, so let's say the bank bought bonds a year ago, they're now worth less. And so now suddenly the bank that thought it had all this money in government bonds doesn't have that money because it's when they're coming to the end of their investment, they're not getting paid back what they thought. If that's happening at the same time that people are having less confidence in the bank, there's withdrawals or investors are pulling back, then this is a bad sort of combination of events, if you will. And that's part of what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. But a lot of banks are dealing with this right now because of the rising interest rates. And so this is why there's a couple questions about what's going to happen this week. This week, the Federal Reserve is meeting again. Inflation is still historically high. There's a prediction that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates again. And the question is, will that spook investors or anybody further to say, oh my goodness, these banks with all these bonds, they're going to be in trouble as these rates continue to go up. So that's something to really watch midweek. But here's the second takeaway I wanted to get to, which is technology has changed so much of what we're doing. In 2008, the first iPhone had been out for a year. A lot of people, including yours truly, was on a BlackBerry. I certainly wasn't banking from my BlackBerry. I was still going to the ATM. I was still actually having to do some things in person. And that's not what's happening now, because with a click of a button, I can withdraw funds really fast. And so the other conversation besides just raising the number, the dollar amount that the government may insure for depositors in banks here at home, there's also a question about, well, has regulation just been too slow? Is technology just moving too fast? And this is a unique problem for this time that we're in. High inflation, you have the dropping value of bonds. Banks are getting kind of caught in this web of these variables that are happening. And then, of course, you also have people being able to move money so quickly. So a run on the bank could happen in minutes. Whether it's a stock run on the bank where stocks are just getting sold very fast, people are ditching their stocks, or whether or not they're actually withdrawing money. And so we'll have to watch that to see if the conversation continues there about, well, are we just in a completely different environment that's going to require some more regulation? That could potentially hamstring consumers and investors from being able to do that as fast because of the consequences. And we'll see, because the other argument is a free market is a free market, and a free market will move as fast as people can move. If people can move as fast as a button press, and that's what the market is allowing, then it should allow that. So these are the tensions that are happening with what happens next in the banking system. Okay, I'm going to finish up here with something that's getting a lot of news, but this is a great example of at Smarter News why we want to proceed cautiously and do things differently than other news sources. So I'm sure over the last several days, you have seen headlines about a certain political story in the United States, which has been whether or not President Trump, former President Trump, will be indicted on Tuesday. Now, why would we even have that question? Why do we have that question? We have that question for a few different reasons. I mean, the background is that President Trump is under investigation in a few different ways. There's the federal investigation into his keeping of records at Mar-a-Lago, government records. We've talked about that regarding the National Archive, how these records were stored, what they were. There's also an investigation into January 6th and his role in that event at the Capitol. There's also an investigation happening in New York on what we believe to be a few different things that had to do with his business dealings in a variety of different ways. Some have concluded and not led to any charges. Well, now there's one that may lead to a charge. The whole reason, though, there's even a question about whether or not President Trump could be arrested this week is because he himself said it. That needs to be very, very, very clear, that an entire news cycle is being driven off what the former president said about an investigation that is ongoing. A couple years ago, I was interviewing Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, prominent speaker at the time in the Republican Party, but still talks a lot about the Republican Party, the way forward, and what Republicans are generally doing in Congress and outside. And one of the things that he said, this was just during the start of President Trump's administration, he said to me, this is during a live interview, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he since has used this in a lot of different ways. I'm sure this is something he goes back to very often. Newt Gingrich said to me, the media will chase a rabbit. All you have to do is give them one. And I remember just thinking to myself, wow, that's a great thing to remember as a journalist, because he's right. Whether it's a leak, it's an unnamed source, it's two people with knowledge of an event, it's a former president, the media will chase something that sounds like a good headline. And we should, but we should never forget to remind our audience about why we're chasing it and why we also have to be skeptical. President Trump may be arrested this week. He could be arrested this week. By the way, he could potentially be arrested at any time if any of these investigations led to an indictment. That's been on the table. That's part of the reason why there's been so much talk about what's going to happen with these investigations, especially as we get more into the presidential cycle for 2024. And he's already announced his run for the presidency, because what we could see is a former president arrested and charged with a crime while also trying to run for president, which is something that we haven't seen before. So, but that could happen at any moment. I mean, that could have happened for any reason if these investigations, if the grand juries at the heart of these investigations decided there was a crime to be charged, if the prosecutors also decided there was enough there to go forward. This particular case that seems to be the one that President Trump is talking about has to do with a 2016 payment to a woman who goes by the name Stormy Daniels, but let's use her real name. Let me see here. I have it written down. I think that's important. You likely know her as Stormy Daniels. Stephanie Clifford is her legal name. And the question here is about money. And about money, it's been referred to as hush money. Money can be paid to someone in exchange for their silence. In certain situations, that's totally illegal. I could sign a contract and I could say for $100, I've decided I'm not going to share in the inner workings of Smarter News. For example, that's what my secrecy is worth. And in those cases, that's a legal agreement. The question in this particular case seems to be, from what we know of it, which is not laid out before us publicly entirely, is whether or not how the money was exchanged, whether or not it was the accounting records were falsified in any way, where the money came from. So that seems to be at the center of this question about this particular case and President Trump's flair that he threw up, which is that I'm going to be arrested. So the question here is he? We have no idea. Could it happen this week? Could it happen in the next couple weeks? Maybe. Could it not happen at all? Absolutely. So all of these are on the table. And I just want to remind you that they're there, that those possibilities are there. The question that seems to come up for prosecutors, and I was looking to try to find lawyers that weren't particularly political, because there's obviously a lot of accusations about whether or not the New York DA could be filing this case at this time, especially as we're moving into this political cycle, for political reasons. So here's something just to consider. This is from Renato Mariotti. He's a former federal prosecutor. He's calling this an indictment, this potential indictment, any indictment actually at this point, an aggressive move. He's saying this, quote, "They're bringing a case that is out of the ordinary," if they do. "It's rare for payments of this type to be the subject of criminal charges. There is a risk that not only they will potentially lose at trial, but there's also a risk on appeal that the New York courts could decide that this is not properly charged." So I just share that quote to show that there is a multitude of complexity here. We'll have to wait and see what happens for President Trump and these multiple investigations. And we have to be really careful not to drive too far down a road from one social media post from one particular person. We saw that a lot during President Trump's administration. We're seeing that now from a lot of different politicians using social media in a way that serves them. I don't know if this is the case here, but I think it's a friendly reminder that we have to be careful, just like these other headlines about fighter jets going to Ukraine, an arrest warrant for President Putin, a potential indictment for President Trump. We have to just, the story is developing at its own pace. It's developing at its own pace, and we can't force it. We don't know what's going to happen next. All we know is the information in front of us. So let me share something here as we end. A little bit of a lighter note. There has been, since spring has sprung, there are a few little babies that we're paying attention to. And the symbolism here is not lost on us, because they're bald eagle babies that have hatched in Washington, D.C. to their proud parents. Let me see if I pull them up here. Rosa and Martin. And we actually have a live stream of them as they're being fed by their parents. And they'll be there for a couple weeks in the nest. Apparently, bald eagles, they lay 1 to 3 eggs. So the fact that we have 3 babies here is a big deal. In the nation's capital, with the national symbol of the bald eagle as a symbol of freedom. It's hard to stop watching these little babies. They're so cute. One of the fun facts our team found was that it's not just the mother that feeds the babies. The father also feeds the babies. So you would assume that's the mother with the beak and the little beak. No, it could be either parent. And so mom just might need to go for a little fly around town, stretch her wings and get a deep breath before she goes back to the nest, take care of her little ones. But both parents are responsible for feeding the bald eagle babies. So there's a fun fact for spring as we end. That's a better story to end on than some of the ones that we had to cover today about the way forward in a war, the stability of the financial system, and some potential political upheaval here in the United States. So I look forward to your questions, comments, concerns. As always, a lot of these stories, again, are marinating on Monday. So as we see updates needed, we'll be right here with you. I'll send you alerts if that's what it needs. We'll make sure to keep all of our social media channels updated, as well as our website. But if there's any big news, we'll be right back here with you answering your questions. So keep your questions and comments coming, and we'll always have more on smarternews.com. Enjoy your first day of spring.